Hello everyone. This week I learned about something that's really quite near and dear to my heart, and it's about learning motivation, learning how to be motivated. And the way I did that is by looking at the human reward system and how it works. So, the contents of this week's video are going to be how the reward system works, an example of what training looks like, and how training can fail by taking it to the extremes. Now, first of all, the reward system. The reward system basically works like this. You have an input stimuli. Is this stimuli positive? No? Wait for the next stimuli. Is the stimuli positive? Yes. Then you learn, how do I get more of that? How do I get more of that stimuli? And what situation am I currently in that in the future I know I have access to this stimuli again? So what's a positive? How do we evaluate whether this is a yes or no? And there are two sources of positives. There's the biological positives, where you will evaluate, for instance, food, water, sex, parental investment, and increasing the surviving of yourself and of your kin. That's a biological positive that would motivate you to do something. And there are learned positives, and learned positives are derived from biological positives via conditioning. And one type of conditioning is classical conditioning, and you'll probably have heard of it using Pavlov's conditioning, where he had some meat and saw that a dog was salivating. And he had a bell in which the dog initially had no response to. Once he started ringing the bell before giving the dog the meat, and he continued this for a bit, the dog got trained to respond to the stimulus of the bell, and thus started salivating once the bell rang. So basically, classical conditioning is the mapping of a neutral stimulus, which is in this case the bell, with a biological stimulus, which is the meat, in order to produce a response. In this case, dopamine. Dopamine instead of salivation. Now, what's really interesting about this is that rewards are not necessarily tied to what you want. They're tied to what you've learned to condition with a specific reward. Associate. Now, in this case, we're talking about dopamine excretion, because we're talking about whether your brain evaluates something positively or negatively. Now, dopamine is highly correlated with motivation. If there is a release of dopamine, it generally means that you will be motivated to take a certain action. Now, for a long time, they thought that dopamine was responsible as like a pleasure hormone. But it turns out it's actually most likely responsible for encoding the memories about a reward. How do I get it? What are the environmental stimuli? And if you remember in this slide, that's exactly what learning is. So in this graph, it's dopamine just simply replaces learning, and it allows for that mapping to occur. So, key point 2. With the stimuli available, with stimuli available, the ones that reward you will train you to seek them out. Basically, the stimuli that produce dopamine in your brain are more likely to be sought out by you because you're motivated to do so. So that's the core of motivation. Now, let's look at what some training looks like. How is motivation trained in our everyday lives? And for this, let's watch a video.
You didn't make it yourself. Typically, you make boxes.
Well, I did.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. I found the box and then made it.
Shut the hell. Shut up, are you for real?
So, let's take a moment. What we just watched was a man finding out he was going to have a child. And I guess the next question is for you to answer. What did you feel while watching that? For me, that was a good experience. I tear up every time I see this sort of stuff. And this is probably bad, because there exists a whole website to evoke these type of responses from us. And in general, a positive emotion is most likely rewarded by dopamine. And any slide that you see source in description, I'll post a source for my claims. So the reason that it was bad but it felt good was because here we have Reddit, which I have marked just the top 8 things and how engaged they made me and in what way. For instance, there's outrage porn. For instance, the massive GOP betrayal of the democracy requires a forceful democratic response. If that ain't propaganda, I don't know what is, but either way, that this evokes a positive response from me, which is most likely rewarded by dopamine, which is going to make me want to click on the next thing. And what I just learned there, what got engraved into my memory by the dopamine, was that clicking on Reddit is rewarded, which is habit forming. So that was a basic training example. How can we take this to the extremes? What are the extremes of motivation? Now, you know what? Who are the highest motivated people in day-to-day lives? It's drug addicts. Or most likely drug addicts. Addictive substances like nicotine and cocaine release dopamine into the brain, or cocaine also traps it there. This means that cocaine addicts are constantly learning about how, okay, I'm in this place, I'm feeling very good, and this is what I had to get there. So they're very motivated to keep finding cocaine. The same with gambling addicts. A large amount of dopamine is released when you win money. And thus, it's a self-perpetuating cycle. Even if they're losing money, their reward system will tell them, but can you remember that stimulus that got you a lot of dopamine? Let's try and find that again. So drugs are motivating, so motivating that people who take them often forego their initial biological rewards. And you can see this specifically with meth, which is just the most incredible reward system hijack that you can find. Now, this was very highly motivated people. Let's look for low motivation. How can we reduce motivation in animals or people completely? And for this, we turn to an experiment. Now, in this experiment, this little dog doesn't have the option to jump over to the known shock zone initially. The dog will just have to stay in the shock zone and have no way of getting out of the situation. Then, later, after it's dealt with painful shock after painful shock, it is placed in a box where it can jump to a no shock zone. It will not have the motivation to move there on its own. It will not try. The theory of helplessness. This little dog experienced helplessness there. And learned helplessness is a behavior exhibited by a subject after enduring a repeated aversive stimuli beyond their control. In this case, that's the shock. This results in discontinuing attempts to escape or avoid adverse stimulus even when such alternatives are unambiguously presented. And this doesn't just apply to dogs. This also applies to humans, which, and I quote again, although from Wikipedia, learned helplessness theory is the view that clinical depression and related mental illnesses may result from such real or perceived absence of control over the outcome of a situation. Basically, as the theory states that people with depression feel a real absence of control within their lives and thus are not willing to seek such alternatives even if they're unambiguously presented. Sweet! So that was this week's topic. Do you have any questions? It really helps me to know when I was going too fast or going too slow. And I guess I have questions for you. Where in your life do you have high motivation? What motivates you strongly? And where in your life do you have low motivation? I will see you next week. Bye-bye.